Every once in a while, you come across a super rare and ultra cool vehicle, and that's the case with this particular 1979 Pontiac Grand Prix that came equipped from the factory with Pontiac's 301 cubic inch 4-barrel V8 and a 4-speed automatic transmission. Now, if that wasn't strange enough, this car also has less than 1,000 miles on it. So this is an absolutely pristine example of a rare powertrain combination. And we're going to talk about this particular 1979 Grand Prix today, but also a little bit about the history of the 1978 to 1987 Pontiac Grand Prix because, well, I think it's an interesting story. So let's get started with the backstory on this 1979 Grand Prix. The first thing to note is that the origins of the 78 Grand Prix go back to about 1973. And of course, this was the time of the OPEC oil embargo and fuel prices were starting to increase. And General Motors Design thought that its vehicles needed to get leaner and trimmer. And well, that really started with the 1977 full-size General Motors cars like the Impala and Caprice, Catalina, Bonneville, 88, 98, LeSabre, and Electra. But 1 year later, in 1978, the intermediates would be downsized, and that would include this Grand Prix, along with others like the Monte Carlo, the Buick Regal, the Oldsmobile Cutlass Supreme. And here's a sketch from 1973 done by Roger Hewitt of General Motors Design for a potential theme on the 1978 Grand Prix. And it's actually pretty gosh darn close to the final version of the car. Everything from the taillights with those horizontal, thin crossbars there, to the undulating belt line, to this rather stiff and vertical C-pillar, to the creased roof. It's pretty gosh darn close. Now, the deck lid here, obviously, is more ornate than what would make it onto the final car. And I think some of that was because the 78 Grand Prix was really to share more components with its sister vehicles than ever before. So there wasn't as much room for creativity as what Roger had envisioned here. But nonetheless, the 78 Grand Prix continued through the design process. And here's a sketch done by Dave McIntosh on a proposal for this 1978 Grand Prix. Notice that bird beak front end, very similar to what the Grand Prix had for 1973 through 1977. Although Dave has put hidden headlamps here on this particular Grand Prix proposal, and, well, an interesting, let's just call it, grille on this vehicle. Also like the two-tone design of the hood, as well as, well, I guess the upper portion of the hood, as well as the lower portion of the hood, and a bumper that certainly wouldn't pass crash standards, but, well, looks cool. Dave, along with Elia Rusinoff, were two of the lead designers for the 78 Grand Prix. Dave, by the way, would later go on to lead the design of the Buick Riata in Dave North's studio. So, number of prolific General Motors designers participated in this program, even John Manoogian, whom you've seen interviews with on this channel. And here we have a relatively late version, full-size clay model that's been die-knocked. In other words, it has a film stretched over it, the colored film that enables you to think that there's glass as well as paint on the car. Now, this displays a number of similarities to the final vehicle, but also some differences. I would say in terms of the similarities, notice the front end. Of course, the bumper would change. I think designers were hoping that those big bumpers on either side of the grille would be enough to meet the impact standard, and my guess was that that just wasn't true. Here you have more of an undulating belt line than you would see on the final car, and the roof line as well as the windshield is also different. Notice that there's some curvature to that windshield, some pretty significantly curved side glass, and a very formal C-pillar, and of course, wire wheels. I think in this photo at the far left, in the red shirt, is Bill Porter, who is head of the advanced studio that really developed this particular proposal. And to Bill's left, or to the right in the picture, in the black shirt, is Dave McIntosh, the individual that I was mentioning before. What's interesting about this proposal is that as opposed to being, let's say, a forward-looking proposal, this overall design has, let's call it a romantic theme, something that is similar to the cars of yesteryear as opposed to looking forward into where cars would go. And it does so on, well, let's say, relatively slim packaging, and that is exemplified in everything from a bit of what's almost a four-fendered look with that undulating belt line, along with the super thick white wall tires and the wire wheels. Some designers liked this particular aesthetic, and it certainly was popular for the time among the buying public, but others were hoping that General Motors' design would reach further forward into the future. But alas, that was not what was going to happen for this 1978 Grand Prix. And here's the final product, the actual production 1978 Grand Prix. Notice that the front end and that undulating beltline are quite similar, though a little bit toned down. And you do have the bumper that wraps over top of the grille, again, I suspect because of the impact standards that were in place at the time. But you do still have that kind of six-lamp look up front, that grille with big vertical bars. That would be a one-year-only grille. 1979, the texture would change to a crosshatch pattern. And then the rear C-pillar is different. It's more stiff and formal, perhaps because there had to be more shared components on the vehicle at that point than what was actually originally envisioned by designers. Now let's turn to this beautiful 1979 Grand Prix and learn a little bit more about this very rare 301 cubic inch 4-barrel V8 4-speed, less than 1,000 mile car. I actually had the opportunity to buy this car before it was listed on Bring a Trailer, and the seller wanted a, well, let's call it hefty, but I would say reasonable price. It just wasn't something that I was into. I mean, I love manual transmission cars and vehicles like this, but I thought he wanted mostly what it was going to bring on Bring a Trailer, and I was relatively right. So I don't necessarily regret passing on it, as cool of a car as it is. But notice I mentioned for 1979, this is a 79 Grand Prix, and it has that crosshatch grille as opposed to the pure vertical theme. And you have the overall theme that you saw on the clay model. And this car doesn't have a vinyl top, so you can see the form of the C-pillar a bit better, as well as the roof. And you can see it's very tight and crisp, kind of a signature Bill Mitchell, who was the vice president of General Motors design at the time. That was a signature of his, was these tight, crisp lines. In part, that was inspired by Rolls-Royces and some of the British cars of the era, and he just liked that look. And you saw it on a number of General Motors vehicles from the time, even the Bustleback Seville, very tight, crisp roofs. And looking out back at this rear three-quarter view, we can see that Roger Hewitt didn't get everything that he wanted. Remember, he had horizontal chrome bars in the taillights. In 79, they would go to these vertical bars. 78 would have those horizontal bars, and the deck lid in his proposal was much more ornate than what you see here. But something about this car in black just makes it look, I think, overall tighter and crisper than it does in lighter colors or with the vinyl roof. And it's a pretty handsome car in this color combination. Unfortunately, this car does have that big body side molding on it, but hey, what are you going to do? I do love the stainless trim around the windows, something that you still see, well, chrome trim now around the windows. It just gives the overall greenhouse a better look, and I love these wheel covers. These are optional deluxe wheel covers for the 78 Grand Prix. Let's take a look at those in a bit more detail. And here you have a beautiful deluxe wheel cover. So a bit of a turbine vane design, which was very popular at the time, with this octagonal nut that you see here, kind of like the single lug on some of the Packards of the classic era, as well as Rolls-Royces. It's hard to say why the designers picked this particular theme for the wheel covers, but remember, during this time, there were some wheel covers that I think designers really took inspiration from. The 69 Lincoln Mark III wheel cover, for an example, looks very similar to this. And my guess is that reignited the theme with either the octagonal nut or the hexagonal nut that you saw on lots of wheel covers during this time frame. And that Mark III took its inspiration from the Packards of the classic car era. Now let's transition to the interior. And as you can imagine, just like the exterior, the interior was all new for the 78 Grand Prix. After all, the car had dropped about 600 pounds, lost a foot in length, and it was even narrower by, I believe, 1.5 inches or so, maybe even a little bit more. So all new interior here. And unfortunately, that driver-centric cockpit that began with the 1969 Grand Prix was gone by this point. And you have something that has like a driver instrument cluster, but you don't really have a driver-centric cockpit that wraps around toward the driver. Oh well. But you see here that this car is equipped with a 4-speed manual. Doesn't have necessarily a bunch of other options. Notice the crank windows, it's a manual seat. You can tell that it's a low-mileage car because that plastic seatbelt guide is still there. Those often would tend to crack. In this case, you can see that the car has 858 miles on it. It does have the optional trip odometer. No air conditioning in this car, by the way. And one of the nice features, though, I will say, is when you turn the bright lights on, that Pontiac logo illuminates. That's what that light blue illuminated Pontiac logo in the middle there means. For years, Pontiac would have the Indian Chief illuminated in the dash when you had the bright lights on. And before that, in the 1950s, there was the Chief's head that would illuminate at the end of the hood at night. But Pontiac still kind of kept that alive with this bright light indicator that I thought was pretty cool and a nice touch in these vehicles. And here's the area to the right of the clock. Notice that this car has the optional rally gauge package. It does have those vents, but no air conditioning, just an AM radio. And this really started that modular dash theme, I would say, for Pontiac with those exposed screws that would continue on for a number of years subsequent to the introduction of this 78 Grand Prix. Some people like it, some people hate it. Interestingly, on some Pontiacs, those Allen head screws are fake, and some of them are fake, some of them are real. So if you're going to take apart the dash or interior trim, you really have to have the manual because it's hard to discern which ones are not real and which ones are. And here's a closer look. You can see that 4-speed shifter in this particular photo. Again, this was a rare combination. In fact, it was only 1 year, this 301 cubic inch V8 paired with the 4-speed. You could just get that in 1979. You couldn't get that in any other year. So very, very strange to find that in this vehicle. I suppose it was a little bit fun to drive. I think the 301 was making 150-ish horsepower. Not that great, but this car wasn't that heavy by this point at all. It was about 3,300, 3,400 pounds, so relatively light car. Not that great power under hood, but I'm sure it was okay and, well, fun for the time. By the way, this generation of Grand Prix, this 78 to 87 Grand Prix, was the first generation of Grand Prix to have a standard V6, the Buick 3.8-liter V6 in them that, depending on the year, made in the low 100 horsepowers. So not very sporting for a car that really began life as something that was supposed to be a sporty version of the short wheelbase Pontiacs. The Grand Prix was introduced in 1962 based on the Catalina. And here we have the Pontiac 301 4-barrel V8 under hood. Now, a lot of people will say there's no Pontiac small block, big block, and that's kind of true. Any Pontiac V8 that ranged from 326 cubic inches all the way up to 455 cubic inches, which was the largest Pontiac V8, has the same physical exterior dimensions. So you can't really tell just looking at it. You have to take other clues or look at the engine code that is stamped into the block just below the passenger side cylinder head and look up what that code is to figure out what kind of Pontiac V8 you have under hood. Now the 301 as well as the Pontiac 265 cubic inch V8. The 265 was available from 1980 to 81. It was a very briefly available engine. And these have a shorter deck height, so they are physically smaller. Now one thing I will say about the 301, and perhaps why you had to be careful about having this teamed with a manual, is that the 301 really was not that robust when it came to the bottom end. The crankshaft has only 2 counterweights. That's it, one at either end. It's a rather flimsy piece, and it works just fine so long as you're not revving the engine north of 4,000 RPM. So I would say if you have one of these 301s, you can drive it, but don't hold the shift point beyond what the transmission would normally shift the engine at and go into a higher gear because you're going to potentially run into bottom-end issues. And here's one last under-hood photo. I thought this one was interesting because the owner has put in either an NOS Delco Freedom battery or has put a battery topper, which is more than likely the case here, to disguise the look of the overall battery and make you think that it's the original battery. Regardless, it looks good. It's definitely period correct. And it's too bad that the 301 didn't make a little bit more horsepower in this application. The Firebirds would get a turbo 301 cubic inch V8 in top form. But this Pontiac V8 was on its way out by this point. It would just be around for a few more years before it would be sunset, and that would be the end of the Pontiac V8s. Well, I hope you enjoy the spotlight on this super rare 1979 Pontiac Grand Prix 4-speed, 301 cubic inch, less than 1,000 mile vehicle, and that you learned a little bit about the design history of the 1978 to 87 Grand Prix. If you liked it, please be sure to drop a comment in the comment section, and thanks again for watching.